Australian journalist and founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, has turned 50 years old. He's spending his 50th birthday in Belmarsh prison, a Category A men's prison on the outskirts of London. It's notorious for housing some of Britain's worst criminals, including members of Al-Qaeda, and has been dubbed Britain's Guantanamo Bay. So why is a journalist and a publisher in a maximum security prison? There are many misconceptions about Julian Assange's case. I'm Richard Medhurst, and I covered his extradition hearing in London, so I'll clear up some of these myths. The first is that Julian Assange is in jail because of the 2016 elections. This is completely false. The United States is charging Julian Assange over leaked documents about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The indictment has nothing to do with the 2016 elections. The United States is charging him with 17 counts under the Espionage Act and 1 count under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. In total, he's facing 175 years in prison in an indictment that seeks to effectively criminalize national security journalism. Now, people say that Assange committed treason. This is not only false, but ridiculous. Julian Assange is an Australian citizen. He's not American. He did not publish anything or carry out any work inside the United States. Julian Assange doesn't owe the United States allegiance, nor did he break some sort of non-disclosure agreement. The fact that the United States is trying to extradite an Australian man all the way from the United Kingdom to face 175 years in jail should scare anyone. What would you say if China or Russia were trying to extradite an American journalist to face jail time for something they published in another country? Another myth you hear is that Julian Assange is not a journalist, and therefore he has no right to publish any documents. This is patently false. First of all, Julian Assange is most definitely a journalist. He's accredited by the International Federation of Journalists and has done more journalistic work than most of his critics put together. And more importantly, the First Amendment in the United States doesn't care if you're a journalist or a teacher or a plumber. Everyone has the right to freedom of speech, whether they're a journalist or otherwise. People also think now that what Assange did is unprecedented. Again, it's not. The New York Times published the Pentagon Papers, classified documents given to them by whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. Many people have and do this all the time. Asking sources to be careful or asking sources for classified information is a standard journalistic practice. Out of the 18 charges against Assange, there is 1 hacking charge in the indictment. This is meant to portray Julian Assange as something other than a journalist, to smear him and to criminalize anyone soliciting sensitive information or undertaking national security journalism. This charge has been completely debunked in court by several expert witnesses. Now, another myth you often hear is that the documents WikiLeaks published harmed the United States' national security. This is a complete fabrication. The United States admits this themselves. The Pentagon set up an entire review board called the Information Review Task Force, headed by Brigadier General Robert Carr in 2013 to ascertain whether this was true, and found that no one had ever been harmed as a result of WikiLeaks publications. This is the US government saying this. People think that if Assange has nothing to hide now, that he should just go and face the music, and that he would receive a fair trial. This could not be further from the truth. Julian Assange is already guaranteed not to receive a fair trial because the United States spied on him while he was inside the Ecuadorian embassy. When he was forcibly removed from the embassy by London police, his personal belongings were handed over not to the British police, but directly to the Americans, when there was no American indictment yet. This violates his right to due process under the US Constitution, under the European Convention on Human Rights. It goes on and on. UC Global, a Spanish firm, was contracted to do security for the Ecuadorian embassy in London. They spied on Julian Assange. They installed cameras throughout the embassy as well as secret microphones. They even spied on his conversations with his lawyers and had a plot in mind to kidnap and kill him. The testimony of several former employees corroborating this was presented in court, as the head of the firm, David Morales, is currently on trial in Spain. This is a gross breach of the fundamental right to due process. In any other circumstances, a judge would immediately throw this case out, just as they did, by the way, in the Ellsberg case when the US government broke into a psychiatrist's office. Also, more recently, one of the key witnesses in the indictment against Assange, a convicted criminal from Iceland nicknamed Siggy the Hacker, recently revealed that he completely fabricated his testimony against Assange in exchange for a deal from the US. A further myth that you often hear is that Assange evaded justice. This is simply incorrect. Assange was given political asylum by Ecuador in 2012. That is his right under international law. The whole point of political asylum is precisely because someone is being persecuted by the law. Just because it's the law doesn't mean that it's fair. Most of what the Nazis did was technically lawful in Germany. Does that mean that what they did was fair? Of course not. Assange's asylum was withdrawn afterwards by the pro-American president Moreno once he was elected. In exchange for expelling Assange from the embassy, Ecuador received a $4.2 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. And by the way, the company that does security for Moreno's daughter, UC Global, is the same company that did security for the Ecuadorian embassy in London and was contracted by American intelligence to spy on Assange and all his visitors. They even dismantled the phone of Italian journalist Stefania Morizzi without her knowledge. They took photographs of visitors' passports and documents behind their backs. In January 2020, the judge overseeing the extradition, Judge Beretzer, ruled in favor of Assange, and she denied the extradition to the US. She did this solely on health grounds, citing Assange's deteriorating mental and physical health, and the high risk of suicide that an extradition to the US would pose, given the inhumane conditions that he would be placed in. However, at the same time, she agreed with all of the political charges. So while the result may be good for Assange, it's not good for journalists when a British judge is siding with and agreeing with the US prosecution that standard journalistic practices are tantamount to espionage and hacking. US President Joe Biden decided to appeal the decision and is seeking to extradite Assange, continuing Trump's work of attacking the press and criminalizing journalism. This is incredible when people suggest or think that Julian Assange somehow worked with Trump. Trump is the one who unsealed the indictment against him, and Biden is now pursuing the extradition with the appeal. This is not just about the nature of the case, which is bad enough, but simply the number of illegalities, the sheer amount of malpractice, of wrongdoing by the British, American, and Swedish governments. The number of times they have violated Julian Assange's rights and right to due process is absolutely staggering. His rights have been violated under British common law, under US law, under the European Convention on Human Rights, the Convention Against Torture. There is no way you can look at this case and not find extraordinary foul play. And Julian Assange would almost certainly be put in administrative segregation, which is basically solitary confinement. He would receive an unfair trial at the District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, where the people on the jury either work or have family working in the intelligence community and are certain to convict him and find him guilty out of spite. Julian would then be sent to a prison such as ADX Colorado and placed in some of the most inhumane conditions for the rest of his life. The reason that Julian Assange is currently facing 175 years in an American prison, the reason that he's currently locked up in Belmarsh, this is because he published evidence of war crimes. I covered his entire extradition hearing in September 2020, which took place at the Old Bailey in London. Dozens of expert witnesses testified on Assange's behalf, including Noam Chomsky, Andy Worthington, and countless other historians, journalists, doctors, writers, lawyers. They were all unequivocal. What is happening to Assange is unprecedented. It is an attack on the press and press freedoms. It is why all major human rights groups and journalistic organizations worldwide oppose and have condemned his extradition to the United States. Julian Assange is the victim of a political witch hunt. The solicitation, gathering, and publishing of classified materials, this is something that journalists do all the time. These are standard journalistic practices. By threatening Julian Assange, the US is threatening journalists everywhere, no matter what nationality they have, or where they come from, or who they work for, or where they reside. WikiLeaks published evidence of extraordinary crimes by the United States and its allies, including the murder of Iraqi civilians and journalists in the collateral murder video, evidence of kidnapping, rendition, and torture, and much more. The Iraq war logs, the Afghan war diaries, the Guantanamo Bay files, and State Department cables make up some of the most important journalistic works in modern history. Their publication helped torture victims of the CIA obtain compensation. They helped with the disclosure of more than 15,000 Iraqi casualties previously unknown. 15,000, that's more than 4 times the number of victims on 9/11. These publications gave the world a real glimpse into what is happening on the ground and the reality that goes unreported in mainstream media. They exposed to the world the true face of US imperialism. Assange showed that the wars the United States is waging in the name of democracy and freedom are failures. They're vehicles of suffering and death. And this is why he is facing 175 years in a US federal supermaximum prison for telling the truth.